Okay, so to conclude, I thought I'd finish by talking about young people and relating back to some of the things we've looked at throughout the course so far. So we started in the course thinking about the functionalist and conflict perspective, and from that functionalist perspective, young people are seen as carriers of culture and the values of the future. So it's really important that they are kind of trained well and socialised to reproduce the social order, and so the next generation can be like as good as it is now, and hopefully even better. So youth, kind of the education of young people is particularly important from this functionalist position to ensure that society works. They're also seen from that position then if they are rebellious or acting out, they're kind of a threat to that social order and therefore must be dealt with by the state. So it's here through this kind of functionalist position that kind of those definitions between normal and deviant are kind of important to help the deviant become, less deviant. And many of the institutions in society, therefore, are set up to kind of, socialize young people, help them, re-socialize them, to control them, so they conform to the kind of more dominant norms. So you can see from, I suppose, what I've been talking about already, that for someone like myself, as a youth studies person, has a lot of issues with this kind of point of view, because what I feel, and many of us in our field think, is it kind of, underplays or kind of discounts, the structures of society that kind of push, many young people into positions where they have no choice but to rebel, or feel like acting out and crime is really their only choice to kind of get ahead in society or whatever. So rather than seeing deviance here as something that needs to be controlled from the conflict perspective, it's seen as kind of more of an expression of the inequities and discriminations of the way the society works. So in this sense, from the conflict position, youth are seen as more as an age cohort or generation that tend to kind of have more rebellious challenges towards the kind of dominant hegemony, and this is why older people and figures of authority tend to kind of have moral panic and denigration kind of views on them. They're also the most likely to kind of take radical action, or to have less conservative political orientations. So in this sense, young people are central to how social change happens. See the world with new eyes, bring new technologies and perspectives. Young people are always kind of at the coalface of social change. They tend to be the ones that are using new technologies the most. They tend to also be the ones that bear the brunt of economic social change the most. So if there's labour market casualisation, it's young people that tend to cop the brunt of it. And so from that point of view, young people are kind of seen as targets to be controlled and to be governmentalised, and these kind of things, how we've looked at throughout the course. So from the youth studies perspective, we're kind of, I suppose, in many ways combining both of these in a way, but I would say it tends to be from more the conflict perspective. We're doing research with young people to allow them to express some of these things in ways, because most other parts of their lives they're kind of shut down from doing so. And we can think about this through the kind of socialization process. There's a great study from the 90s by Stephen Miles and colleagues called Fitting and Sticking Out. And throughout that kind of youth culture transitional period, how there's demands in terms of the socialization processes in the way that you want to fit in and in the world, but also be yourself, that you kind of do both of these things. There's both individualization and conformity that happens in that period. So some level of conformity is inevitable, but also young people tend to deny that they're conformists. And so when you're doing kind of research with young people in subcultures or even in schools, you see this all the time where they kind of are acting the same way and dress the same way, but kind of talk about themselves as individuals. This is where we learn to perform ourselves, and this is kind of constant play off between individuality and pseudo-individuality, which are concepts that we've looked at throughout the course. Here, in that kind of rites of passage period, as young people kind of pushing the boundaries, going out by themselves, meeting new people, taking risks, this is where that kind of fitting in and sticking out kind of things happen as we kind of, learn to be ourselves. In terms of gender, again, youth culture is kind of a really interesting thing to look at in terms of how gender is expressed. As I said earlier on, in those kind of earlier subcultural studies, young women are often positioned as kind of as girlfriends or support, not part of the scenes in their own right. And like when further research was done, that was kind of definitely shown not to be the case. But also that young women tend to often socialise and do their youth culture in different ways than men. So, yeah, not only do young women take part in those things, what this kind of highlighted was there's this kind of distinction happening in research between youth cultural practice that happens in public space and then that happens in private space, in bedrooms and households and stuff like that. And so masculinity and femininity was seen as ways of uncovering the different ways that those kind of spaces would function, what would happen in there, what were the norms and transgressions, what was resistance, what was self-expression. Recent notions of post-feminism are a good example of this, where Ros Gill and other colleagues talk about how young women today often don't feel as much a need to be a feminist because they feel the feminist work has been done. There's more women in the workforce and more feelings of self-expression or whatever. And what this leads to is often a kind of repackaging and retransmission of kind of gendered stereotypes and gendered inequalities because of that. So here, gender and youth culture is a particularly interesting way to kind of shine a lens on how gender works in society, and the study of Riot Girl in particular, a kind of feminist, kind of post-punk, grunge subculture from the 90s is a really good example of that. And again, there's some really interesting research done around this if you want to check that out. Again, young women supporting themselves in a kind of male-dominated scene. The documentary called Riot Girl is a really good place to start to look at that if you're interested in checking out an example. Again, though, with something like Riot Girl, you can see the aesthetics and symbols of it are kind of today almost kind of co-opted into pop music. And so again, the rebellion symbolic nature of this is interesting to kind of trace over time. When it comes to race and ethnicity, young people from ethnic backgrounds that are particularly discriminated against, especially in public space. And you can see this, through anything around like the massive exaggeration of kind of Sudanese gangs in Melbourne, which pretty much don't exist, or the moral panics around rap and 1-4 and stuff like that in Australia. The Islamophobia around the Cronulla riots is a classic example of this. So if you kind of want to see a case study of that, check out the work around that. But then what this means is that subcultures and the creation of subcultures become particularly valuable spaces for people that are discriminated against to be able to kind of express themselves, to, again, as I was talking about before, find people like themselves that are experiencing similar things to be able to kind of create a sense of community and sense of conviviality and a sense of creativity to be able to express themselves and to be able to kind of fight back against these kind of discriminations. In particularly in a kind of relating to globalization, notions of remix culture and hybridity are important here in terms of the way that things are kind of bricolage and cut and pasted to create new things. And Anita Harris's work in Australia has been particularly valuable to think about multiculturalism through this kind of lens, particularly for second generation youth who must deal with living across both, their parents who often still speak the language from their home, through to kind of living in Australia and learning to kind of appropriate aspects of Australianness into their kind of cultural practices, and then kind of create an independent life for themselves. In youth studies in particular, in the transitions realm, the notion of risk society, the work of Beck and others has been particularly important to conceptualise what's going on in terms of that elongated transition, particularly because, as I've spoken about already, young people are constantly at the vanguard of social changes. They kind of often create them, but are often on the pointy end of them as well. So notions of individualisation, detraditionalisation and reflexivity have been particularly valuable in youth studies, and they're concepts I was using a lot in my PhD research about 15 years ago. So what's interesting here is like young people from an ever earlier age, in kindergarten, like you're kind of encouraged to think about what you want to be when you grow up. And there's this kind of installation of competitiveness and this idea of meritocracy, that you have to fill up all your time to be kind of be productive and doing things, even if that's kind of, playing. You have to kind of make sure that you're kind of playing the right sport and meeting the right people. And so this, the kind of challenge of meritocracy here, the myth of it, has been a key way of thinking about the kind of inequalities in that youth transitional period. The way that class, race, gender, location play a role in like who can more easily take up and put into place the choices that they want to make, the careers that they want to do, the place where they want to live. And it's particularly the case with like things like mental health and health in general and how that works. So in terms of the risk society, it's been a kind of key way of thinking about that youth transition. It's kind of faded away a little bit these days, but it's still kind of very much in the basis of how youth studies was conceptualised. Okay, so I've kind of gone through some, very broad relating back to some of the things that we've been looking at in the course. If you're interested in youth studies and the stuff I've been talking about, there's 2 subjects that you can do that basically are about this kind of stuff. In second semester, online only, so it's online only course, there's no face-to-face. There's youth culture and risk that runs throughout second semester. So there's a list of the kind of topics there. What we do in that subject is essentially teach the research that we do in the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre. So the first 3 or 4 weeks are basically conceptual understandings of what youth studies is, and then we kind of start looking at the research that we've done, in the hospitality industry. I talk about the research that I did with the punk scene that I was talking about before, the stuff about the hipsters and bogans stuff I did. We talk about the financial work we've been doing recently, and I talk to some of my colleagues about their research about labour markets, about gendered body work, and about, some housing stuff. So that's an array of some of the topics. I think some of them have changed a little bit, but it's very broadly, that's what the topic, that subject covers. And in winter, I also am designing this course. It'll actually be coordinated by someone else, but like I'm putting it all together. Consumption technology in everyday life. I've kind of written this course to be essentially an algorithms, artificial intelligence, and everyday life course. And so there's the list of topics there, and we'll be touching upon and going into great detail, really, the stuff that we kind of touched upon in the week in this course on digital sociology. We're looking at the importance of algorithms and AI today, the way that data is very much central to how we become selves, and the way that kind of automates inequality. We're looking at the way that kind of platforms and data affect the way that culture is consumed and practiced today. Looking at the ways that kind of this affects our body, the way that around selfies and notions of beauty. Looking at the way that advertising is increasingly automated, and then looking more broadly at the way this means, how this relates to notions of colonialism, class, and resistance. So if you're interested in that topic, it runs compressed over 4 weeks in winter. So please check that out. And lastly, again, if you're interested in youth studies, there's a bunch of people that you can look up there. Dave Farouge has actually left. He's no longer here, and so is Josh Healy. But the rest there, you'll be able to look at our profiles, look at the website of the Research Centre in general. We've also got a YouTube channels where we kind of have all our seminars, so you'll be able to find those as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed the course overall. This is the last lecture, and hopefully I'll be able to see you in future sociology topics. So thanks for listening. Thanks.